If you've been following the Nolan Wells case, you've probably heard one version of events repeated over and over again. According to friends who were with him that 4th of July weekend, Nolan chose to stay behind on Horn Island, while everyone else headed back to the mainland. It sounded simple enough at first. A young man decided to spend a little more time on the island, with people he had met that day, and his friends eventually left without him. But over the past several weeks, that explanation has come under increasing scrutiny. Investigators have interviewed dozens of witnesses. Family members have continued asking difficult questions. Independent experts have weighed in, and now one of Nolan's friends has given a lengthy interview describing what he says happened during those final moments before the boats pulled away from Horn Island. Whether that interview answers the biggest questions or raises even more of them depends on who you ask. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy thoughtful, fact-based updates on cases like this, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future developments. Now, let's get into today's story. Tonight, we're taking a careful look at what Nolan's friend said, how his account compares with earlier reports, and why investigators are still working to piece together exactly what happened on July 4th. Some details remain unclear, and several parts of the investigation are still ongoing. As always, we'll distinguish between what has been publicly reported, what witnesses have said, and what investigators have confirmed. To understand why this latest interview has attracted so much attention, we first have to go back to the beginning. On the 4th of July, Nolan Wells joined a group of friends for what was supposed to be a holiday trip to Horn Island, a popular destination off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. During holiday weekends, the island attracts dozens of boats filled with families and groups of friends looking to spend the day swimming, relaxing, and enjoying the water. By all accounts, the atmosphere that morning was festive. Boats lined the shoreline. Music played across the water. People moved from one group to another throughout the afternoon. According to witnesses interviewed later, it wasn't unusual for someone to arrive on one boat and leave on another. That detail would eventually become one of the most discussed aspects of this case. As the afternoon wore on, Nolan reportedly spent time with a young woman named Katie. According to one of his friends, the two were seen sitting together near the shoreline, laughing and talking while others prepared to leave. That friend recently described Nolan as someone who brought energy wherever he went. He said Nolan was like a brother to him and recalled seeing him smiling only minutes before the group began getting ready to leave the island. Then came the moment that has become central to the investigation. According to the friend's account, everyone was preparing to depart when Nolan's name was repeatedly called from the boat. The friend said Nolan was told more than once to get on board before they left. Instead, Nolan reportedly answered that he planned to stay on the island and ride back later with someone else. The witness emphasized that this wasn't an unusual decision for people visiting Horn Island, and claimed that several others had done the same that day. If that's exactly what happened, the story seems straightforward. Nolan made his own decision, stayed behind, and expected to return later. But another detail stood out. The friend also said Katie later sent a message confirming that she had witnessed those final moments herself. According to his account, she remembered hearing people call for Nolan to get on the boat before he declined and stayed behind. For many viewers, that appeared to strengthen the friend's version of events. Yet investigators weren't finished examining the timeline. Authorities later interviewed dozens of people who had been on or around Horn Island that afternoon, as they attempted to reconstruct exactly who was where and at what time. According to reporting discussed in the source material, approximately 60 witnesses were interviewed during the investigation. At first, that seemed straightforward. Then, something unexpected happened. The timeline surrounding the emergency distress call began attracting renewed attention. Audio released by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources captured a call from a boat reporting that it was taking on water and beginning to sink. That recording quickly spread online, with many people listening closely for background sounds and trying to determine whether Nolan could somehow be heard during the call. But according to commentary included in the source material, there are sharply different interpretations of that recording. Some believe the audio has been misunderstood, while others argue it deserves closer examination alongside the rest of the evidence. That disagreement matters because investigators are trying to establish one simple fact that remains surprisingly difficult to answer with complete certainty. Exactly where was Nolan during those critical moments after the boats began leaving Horn Island? His friend's interview offers one version of the timeline. The emergency call introduces another point investigators continue to examine. And before long, additional evidence, including witness statements and location data, would add yet another layer to a case that has already left many people searching for answers. That brings us to one of the biggest points of disagreement in this investigation. For many people following the case, the friend's interview seemed to answer an important question. If Nolan truly decided to remain on Horn Island after being asked several times to return to the boat, then perhaps the mystery centered on what happened after everyone else left. But investigators weren't relying on one person's memory alone. They began comparing witness statements with other pieces of evidence, including GPS information, emergency calls, and interviews conducted in the days that followed. According to reporting discussed in the source material, the distress call reporting that the boat was taking on water came before GPS data indicated the boat actually departed the island. Investigators reportedly noted that if witness accounts did not match the location data, that inconsistency needed to be examined carefully. That doesn't necessarily mean anyone was being dishonest. Memories can become unreliable during stressful situations, especially after a frightening emergency on the water. Still, investigators know that even small differences in timing can become important when reconstructing the final hours before someone disappears. Then another voice entered the discussion. Former police officer Brandon Tatum, who interviewed several of Nolan's friends, offered a different perspective after reviewing the widely circulated distress call. He argued that listeners should be careful about assuming they were hearing Nolan's name or evidence of something happening to him in the background. According to Tatum, witness interviews, text messages, and video footage all suggested Nolan was no longer on the boat when that emergency call was made. He also pointed to another detail. The reported GPS coordinates placed the boat near the island, where many other boats and hundreds of people were spending the holiday. If a major confrontation or emergency involving Nolan had happened aboard that vessel, Tatum questioned whether it could have gone unnoticed by so many nearby witnesses. For some viewers, that explanation seemed reasonable. For others, it left new questions. If Nolan truly remained on Horn Island after the boat left, then where did he go next? Who saw him last? And why has it been so difficult to establish a complete timeline for those final hours? According to sources referenced in the script, investigators received information from witnesses who reportedly placed Nolan on Horn Island after his friend's boat had already departed. If those accounts are accurate, they would support the idea that Nolan stayed behind rather than leaving with the original group. But another issue soon became part of the conversation. Reports surfaced suggesting Nolan had been drinking during the 4th of July gathering. According to the source material, investigators were aware of information describing his alcohol consumption that day, though toxicology results were still being discussed. As soon as that information became public, reactions were immediate. Some people believed alcohol could explain how a tragic accident occurred. Others argued that focusing on drinking risked distracting attention from the larger, unanswered questions. One commentator noted that several young people at the gathering appeared to be drinking, asking why attention seemed to focus primarily on Nolan. The same commentary questioned whether alcohol alone could explain every unusual detail that had surfaced during the investigation. Those remarks reflected the commentator's opinions rather than established investigative findings. Meanwhile, Nolan's family continued pushing for additional answers. From the beginning, they said they were not satisfied with an early assumption that the case could simply be explained as an accidental drowning. Instead, they wanted every piece of evidence examined independently. That determination eventually led to a second autopsy performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell. According to the family's attorney, Dr. Mitchell concluded that the cause and manner of Nolan's death should be classified as undetermined. The report also described an area of discoloration beneath the skin on the back of Nolan's head that investigators had not publicly explained. Just as significant, the independent examination reportedly could not include Nolan's lungs or throat because those tissues were unavailable during the second autopsy, limiting what conclusions could be reached about drowning. That finding changed the conversation. Rather than settling the debate, it introduced another layer of uncertainty. An independent forensic pathologist later explained that determining drowning can be especially difficult after a body has been recovered days later and examined more than once. According to that expert, drowning is often considered a diagnosis reached after excluding other possible causes, and decomposition can make those determinations much more challenging. So, despite months of interviews, public discussion, and expert analysis, investigators and Nolan's family were still facing many of the same difficult questions. His friend's latest interview may have provided additional context about what happened on Horn Island that afternoon. But it did not explain everything that happened afterward, and as attorneys began seeking phone records and social media evidence, while investigators continued reviewing witness statements, the search for definitive answers was far from over. As this investigation has continued, one thing has become increasingly clear. The questions surrounding Nolan Wells' death have not disappeared with time. In many ways, they've become more focused. Instead of asking only what happened on the 4th of July, investigators, attorneys, and Nolan's family have been trying to answer a much narrower question. Which pieces of evidence can be independently verified, and which parts of the story still rely on conflicting accounts? That distinction matters. Every major investigation eventually reaches a point where witness statements, physical evidence, and expert opinions either begin supporting one another or start pulling in different directions. In Nolan's case, there are still areas where those pieces don't fit together as neatly as everyone would like. One of the biggest developments came after the family's independent forensic examination. According to the source material, Dr. Roger Mitchell determined that Nolan's cause and manner of death should remain undetermined. That conclusion did not declare that Nolan drowned, nor did it conclude that he was the victim of a homicide. Instead, it reflected the limitations of the available evidence and the condition of the body at the time of the second examination. For Nolan's family, that finding reinforced what they had been saying from the beginning. They believed more questions needed to be answered. Another forensic expert later explained why reaching a definitive conclusion could be extremely difficult under these circumstances. According to that expert, drowning is often a diagnosis made after excluding other possible causes of death. When a body has been in the water for several days and has undergone significant decomposition, determining exactly what happened becomes much more challenging. That explanation doesn't solve the mystery, but it helps people understand why experienced forensic specialists can sometimes reach cautious conclusions instead of absolute ones. Meanwhile, the legal process continued moving forward. According to the source material, attorneys representing Nolan's family, began using subpoenas in an effort to preserve phone records and social media data they believed could be relevant to the investigation. Digital evidence has become an increasingly important part of modern investigations because messages, photographs, videos, and location information can sometimes help investigators establish a more accurate timeline than memory alone. Whether those records ultimately answer any of the remaining questions has not yet been publicly determined. For now, many of the key facts remain unchanged. Investigators have interviewed dozens of witnesses. A friend has publicly described Nolan choosing to remain on Horn Island after being asked several times to return to the boat. Other witnesses reportedly placed Nolan on the island after that boat had already departed. Experts have offered differing interpretations of the emergency distress call. The independent autopsy concluded that the cause and manner of death were undetermined. And despite months of investigation, authorities have not publicly released every answer the family has been seeking. Cases like this are difficult, not only because of the unanswered questions, but because every new piece of information is examined from multiple perspectives. Some people believe the existing evidence points toward a tragic accident. Others believe there are still inconsistencies that deserve additional investigation. At this stage, the investigation remains active, and many of the facts that people continue debating online have not been conclusively established through official findings. That's why it's important to separate confirmed information from speculation and to allow investigators to continue following the evidence wherever it leads. For Nolan's parents, however, this case has never been about winning an argument. It has been about understanding what happened to their son. In one of the most emotional moments referenced in the source material, the family renewed its plea for anyone with information to come forward. They asked friends, witnesses, and even strangers who might know something to contact investigators because, in their words, they cannot rest until they have answers. That appeal reminds us that behind every headline, every interview, and every public debate is a family still living with uncertainty. As more evidence is reviewed and additional records are examined, we'll continue following every verified development in this case and bringing you factual updates as they become available. What do you think about the latest interview from Nolan's friend? Does it help clarify the timeline, or do you believe there are still important questions that remain unanswered? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you found this update helpful and want to stay informed as new developments emerge, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next update.